I'm not sure if this is going to be a happy chat or a sad chat. Now, it seems that every second person I bump into these days has a family story that seems sad. Now, growing up, death seemed a long way away, and I can't even remember giving it much of any thought as to how we died. Now, my grandparents lived in Holland, so even when they died, it seemed a little unreal. But then came traffic accidents, air accidents, death in war, terrorists, and the reality that your parents don't live forever. And with that, the subject of what did they die of? Now, the biggie seems to be cancer in its many sad forms, but there is another. It's called dementia. Alison Shaw's mum had dementia, and she's written a book, which was not the easiest thing to read. Is it going to be okay to talk about the subject, Alison?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, you say that with a smile, but I guess it must have been an overall tough thing.
Oh my goodness, it was really tough. It was really tough. I think I used the word harrowing, yeah. But in saying that, it was healing as well.
Can you just give us an overview as to how dementia is defined?
Okay, so in terms of dementia, dementia is like an umbrella term. And under that umbrella, there's five main strains of dementia, the most common being Alzheimer's. So maybe 70% of people who have dementia have Alzheimer's, and Alzheimer's is a slow cognitive decline. Next to that is vascular dementia, which is a result of a stroke, and that's about 20 to 30%, and that too is a cognitive decline. And then the next one is Lewy body dementia, which is what my mother had, and that's only about 15 to 20% of people have Lewy body dementia. It's associated often with Parkinson's, and then the next one is frontal temporal dementia, and that's only about 10 to 15%. I'm not an expert on this, but those are sort of the rough. And then underneath that, there's something like 200 subcategories of these.
If I was to have asked you that question 10 years ago, would you have been able to rattle off that answer?
No. No, I think in my mind, up until this point, Alzheimer's was the umbrella term, and dementia was one variety of Alzheimer's, but that's not actually the case.
Can you remember the very first moment that into your head came the idea or the news that your mum had dementia?
I think you have a suspicion because of some of the behaviours, but you don't want that to happen. So, and we've talked to a lot of people, and there is an element of denial around that in the early stages, because none of us want our loved ones to get dementia. So, and even the person themselves is often will be in an element of denial as well. So in terms of trying to educate people, it's very hard because no one wants to be involved early on, because it's not something that we want to necessarily embrace.
Now, I think of dementia as forgetting stuff. After reading your book, all of a sudden, I could feel myself worrying that I genuinely couldn't remember people's names, and I almost became a little bit frightened that I was at the start of that, and I don't know whether I am or not, but all of a sudden fear started to raise its head.
I think just forgetting is very natural, and it's not indicative of dementia, but if you forget that you have a car, then that's more along more serious lines.
As opposed to forgetting where you left the keys.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
so you forget you've got your keys, but you forget that you even have a car. So it's a little bit more serious than just forgetting names and places.
So was your mum elderly when dementia was diagnosed?
She was in her 80s, yeah. So basically from when she was diagnosed to when she passed on, it was 7 years.
Man, that must have been a long 7 years, because I've read the book.
Yes, it was a long 7 years. And I think that once we got the diagnosis, that actually helped, because then we could focus on what we could do for her.
In some ways, in reading the book, I thought your mum was incredibly fortunate that she had a daughter and a family like yours, because my mind immediately went to what happens to people who don't have anybody, they're all alone. and all of a sudden something like that happens?
I know that tears at my heartstrings because in the final care home that my mum was in, very few people had visitors. And partly because it's hard, it's confronting, and it's awkward, especially, and we even found that the further you go on with this illness, the more people withdraw because you feel inadequate, you feel uneasy, you feel it was nothing to talk about, it's confronting and it's awkward and it's embarrassing, and so the easier thing is to withdraw.
Give me an example of embarrassing.
When you're having a conversation and it's making absolutely no sense, and how do you respond to what's being said? You know, I think of an example where some friends of my mother came to visit her, and because with mums with Lewy body dementia, you have moments when you're very lucid and no one would know, and then it can fluctuate very quickly. So they were having a conversation which they thought was a normal conversation, and then she said, "You know, there's dogs in here that are as big as horses," and they're like, you know, don't want to laugh or cry or you know, like, and where do you go with that conversation? So those sort of things that are just bizarre, and so it's awkward and it's embarrassing, and you're not quite sure how to respond.
Winston Churchill referred to the black dog of depression, and you've entitled your book, "There's a Dog in the Garden." Why did you call it that?
The reason I called it that was because that was the first indication to us that something wasn't right. Because my mother could see, she told us there was a dog in the garden, and we don't have a dog and we've never had a dog. And so to us there was no dog in the garden, but to her there was a dog in the garden. She could see a dog in the garden. So that was the first indication that Mum was seeing things that we weren't seeing. And so from that we went on to, there were children in the garden as well. One day there were men in the garage in white cloaks, and these were real to Mum. She wasn't making it up. These were real to her. So how to navigate through that kind of a reality is very challenging. And there were very much defining moments. Initially we'd say, "Oh no, there's not a dog in the garden. Mum, we don't even have a dog. What are you talking about?" And sort of like, this is bizarre, you know. And then eventually we realised that by doing that we were actually invalidating her and making her feel like, "Oh, but I can see a dog."
So did you end up saying, "Yes, we can see the dog"?
So well, the turning point was when the men were in the garage in the white cloaks, and she was very agitated, and at that point I said to her, "I'll go and get rid of the men, Mum," and that was the defining moment. So I went out to the garage, and it's slightly bizarre because you're going into somebody else's reality, and I think all the way through this, Mum needed to be at the centre of this. It's person-centred care. We wanted to keep her in our reality, because we didn't want her to go down this track, but this was the reality she was in, so we then enter her reality in order to give her peace, in order to validate her and give her dignity. So that was a very defining moment, the day I said, "No, I'll go and get rid of the men." And after that I did say, "I'm getting rid of the dog," or whatever.
Here's a question that I didn't know whether I should ask or not, and we should tell or not. When my mum was dying, towards the end, when it was starting to get quite dramatic in all its forms, there was a part of me that wished that God would take Mum and that she would die. And then I felt immediately really bad. Did you ever, in the midst of all of this, say, "Lord, just take her now and spare her and all of us from this"?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very hard seeing someone that you love dearly and that had been such an amazing person because of a brain disease, be reduced to what we were seeing. And I really struggled with the indignity of it. You know, other terminal illnesses, there's still dignity. You know, the person's still seen as a hero or a brave battler. But when it's a disease in your brain and it affects your personality and it affects who you are, it's like there's still a stigma around it, Gary. You know, it's like it's a conversation stopper when you tell someone that your mother's got dementia. It's like, oh dear, that's, you know. Whereas I see it now, they've got a disease in their head that is so much more difficult to cope with than a disease in another part of your body, because you have no reserves, no resources to be able to navigate through it rationally, you know. So you've got all these things going on in your head, and how do you know, I think they're brave battlers, I think they're heroes, you know, but it does upset me that there's still that stigma. And I mean, if I hadn't been through this experience, I'd probably still be the same, but I see now, and I think going into some of those dementia units, you see these people and you know that each one of them has an amazing story. You know, I know the last place where my mother, and there was a gentleman in there who'd been a lecturer in anthropology. There was another woman who'd been an importer of you know, soft furnishings. So these people were all had their own story, but they had this brain disease, and then it reduces, and we don't want anybody to go through that kind of a journey. But in saying that, I think one of the verses that stood out to me was that let us run with perseverance the race that God's marked out for us, without any conditions, you know, not if it's this or that, but.
So you talked about he was an anthropologist, she was a buyer of soft furnishing. At what point do you remember your mum? When she was a 55-year-old vibrant woman, or in the last days of her dementia? What's in your mind?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that was something I really struggled with when she was towards the end of their life. I couldn't remember who my mum was, because she'd become a different mum. And I really struggled with that. I actually got really distressed by that, because I wanted to try and remember. And you look at a photo, and a photo just doesn't do it for you somehow. It's static, you know. And I remember I emailed my oldest son at the time, and I just said, I'm really struggling. I just want to remember who she was, and I need to see a video. I need to see something that triggers back those memories, because it's very consuming as you're going through this journey. And he wrote me, and it's in the book, he wrote me this lovely long text of all the memories that he had of his grandmother. And then he sent me a video, and it was just a blessing, because I could capture again. But I think even now, Gary, it's still, the last 7 years still are probably dominant, you know, in my memory, which
is. I can feel myself getting upset.
Yeah, which is difficult, because they don't define who she was. That's of her 87 years. That's only a very small amount. There's another 80 years of an amazing woman that she was.
Have you guys got good video?
We have, yeah. We've got some really lovely videos.
Yeah, isn't that amazing how times have changed? Go back 30 or 40 years and there was no thing, you had to have photos or whatever.
Yeah, it brings people alive. You know, you could see her personality. The video was of her dancing in the kitchen to the music, you know, while she was making the dinner, and it's just like, oh yes, twinkle in her eye and alive.
You touched on earlier that she was a great mum.
Absolutely. She's just a beautiful person. She was full of life. She was a very happy person. She was a vibrant person. She was a wonderful host. She loved entertaining, having people around, cooking meals and providing hospitality. She was involved in so many different aspects of our family life, in terms of my dad was a builder, and they built houses together, so she was involved in that capacity. She was very involved in her church right through till near the end of her days, and she was also capable. She led a girls' brigade company, she did a catering, and, you know, she was just an amazing person, but very kind, very jolly, just lovely.
So how did the church deal with it?
At that point in time, they came to live with us, so the church that she'd been a part of for the last 25 years were really not aware of the disease and how it affected her.
So how did Alison Shaw be the member of the family that took on the responsibility of looking after your mum? Because I take it that was your job, right?
And my sister.
And your sister.
Yeah, we did it together. I think when we knew that Mum and Dad could no longer live, independently just because they needed help, it was actually Peter, my husband, who was very much that we need to honour our parents. And he said he was the one that suggested, why don't we buy a house and live together and honour our parents and do this intergenerational living thing, because we're not so good at that in our culture, sadly. But so they came to live with us. So we sold our house and they sold their house and we bought a big house, and they came to live with us, as did my sister. And for a while, our youngest son was still there.
And for a period of time, was that just wonderful?
Yeah, it was absolutely wonderful. For about 3 years, it was really good. And then it was actually my dad that was not well, and that's when changes took place. So Mum was further down the track, yeah. But the intergenerational living was really good. It was wonderful for Mum. She could still cook a few meals and do things around the home. My dad enjoyed doing the gardening, but they didn't have the responsibility of everything. So, yeah. We wanted to model a different way, or try to experiment with a different way to what most of our culture.
And despite the fact it was such a rugged end, do you think the model works? Intergenerational
I think in my ideal...
Put your teeth in, Gary.
I think my ideal was that it would have gone right through to the end of life. So we had 3 years living intergenerational... I've got it as well.
That word.
We had 3 years living like that, and it did work. We wanted it to work, and I think that was part of the reason it worked. But then, when the care became too difficult for us to physically manage, we were unable to physically manage my dad, then we had to look at the care home. And that was hard because it felt like, we didn't want to do it this way around. But yeah, it wasn't about us, it was about them and what was best for them.
That must have been a terrible moment, that first time you left her in the care home. Do you think that she knew that she was being left?
Yes, definitely.
Oh, it makes it even worse then, doesn't it? How did you deal with that?
There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of, I didn't want it to happen this way. It was, it really pulls at your heartstrings. There were a lot of tears. I knew that, I felt also betrayal, that I'd said I'd wanted to look after her and then was not able to. So there was a huge, very, very difficult road to walk down then. And that's when I started to see a counsellor as well, just to get some tools to cope with the long goodbye. It's referred to as ambiguous loss, because the person's still with you, but you're losing them in a way, but not to death as such.
Is that the die twice thing?
Well, dying.
Yeah.
So, you're losing a person. But I think with I haven't really said, but Lewy body dementia is different from other sorts of dementia in that the person is having hallucinations. That's what marks it out as different. So they're having these hallucinations, and when Mum was having a hallucination, she was involved in that reality. But then when she wasn't, she was relatively, So you could be having, like I said, you could be having a good conversation. But then the things the other reasons why we could no longer care for them ourselves was a safety issue.
For her?
Yeah, and for all of us, right. Because for some reason, which I still find really weird, is that she would do things. And yet there was nothing wrong with her eyesight, and the turning point was when I came in one day from hanging out the washing, and she had the matches and she was trying to light the television, thinking it was the log burner. Yep. And I always found that strange, because there's nothing wrong with your eyesight, but it's all to do with the interpretation of what you're actually seeing. So at that point in time, when all of a sudden you realise that your home is a series of potential danger, life-threatening danger, So with her, with the oven, with the microwave, with the ironing, that sort of thing, that she still felt perfectly capable of doing. But you never knew if things flipped, then those things became potentially dangerous.
If she saw things differently then, how do you think she saw her faith?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Gary, because that was something that caused me a lot of strife as well, because to me probably the worst thing in all of this, for having been a beautiful Christian woman, was losing a connection with God. It's like the ultimate, isn't it? You know, where Jesus said, "Why have you forsaken me?" Because he'd lost that connection. And I thought, you know, to think that she had felt neglected or abandoned by God was probably one of the most tormenting
And
things
do you think
for
that she
myself.
might have thought that?
I don't know, but what a friend said to me is that in Romans it says, "Nothing can separate you from the love of God."
Amen.
And so I used to say, "Nothing, Lord, you said nothing can separate." So I choose to believe your word that nothing can separate my mother, not even Lewy body dementia, from the love of God.
So there was a time...
How she received that love or interacted with it, I don't know, but I firmly believe that that verse is the truth, you know.
So she was a praying mum?
Absolutely.
And then there came a point where she wouldn't have known how to pray anymore?
She still could. Sometimes there was some of my colleagues would visit her and they would pray with her, and there were moments when she would pray beautifully. There was like triggers, you know, like some triggers from the past. So occasionally, and my colleagues are Salvation Army officers, so of course they're in uniform. And so I think that somehow there was a trigger when they would walk in the room with the uniform on, that something triggered, and they could have quite a lovely conversation with her.
And then burst into a boundless salvation. That's such a great hymn, isn't it?
Yeah.
My dad, who's now nearly 94, is suffering from cold feet. And he said, "That's going to happen to you, Gary, because you're my son. One day you're going to have cold feet." Does it ever cross your mind that one day you might have dementia?
I think it's always at the back of your mind, Gary, yeah. Because, I mean, the studies, I mean, and there needs to be a lot more done around dementia in terms of research. But the studies at the moment are saying it's not necessarily a genetic condition, you know, that's not passed on. But I don't think anybody really knows, you know. But it's definitely at the back of your mind at times when you do something silly or forget something or whatever. You think, oh no.
Well, of course, there's you and your mum,
yes,
and it's the mother-daughter, but there are grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The ripples surely must... How did all that work?
The grandchildren, my daughter was amazing because she lives locally. And she has children of her own. And one of the nicest relationships in those last few years of my mother's life was her relationship with her great-grandchildren, because they had no expectation, you know. They just, this is great-grandma and this is who she is. So
they draw the pictures.
Yeah, and would sit on her knee and just, you know, I remember the little fella falling to sleep on her bed one day, and, you know, so that was a beautiful relationship with them. And
you think that even at the latter stages of dementia, your mum may have been aware of the relationship that she was holding with the family?
Yeah, I think so. I think they'd come in and her face would light up when she saw these little ones, yeah.
Alison, there must have come the time when there was just hours left of life. How did you guys feel at that time? Was it sort of relief, sadness? How does that work?
I think that the overriding feeling would be relief, that at last Mum was going to be free of this disease. And I think for a lot of people, when you've seen your family suffering, that there's a sense of a relief. I think the fact that she was a Christian, it was a lovely feeling that she would go and be in her right mind and be in heaven, and no more restrictions, no more issues going on, no more pain, no more suffering, or sorrow. When she did actually go to heaven, there was a wonderful sense of relief, but tinged with the sadness for what she'd suffered. And I think that's across the board for anybody when they lose a loved one. But I think my life's the richer probably because of it, in terms of my faith and what I've learned about dementia and what I've seen, especially about the care that they're given in some of these rest homes, where Mum was at the end, was just fantastic. Really, really doing things that most people would never know about, would never, know that goes on behind closed doors. So, and that's why I dedicated my book to those unsung heroes who daily care for loved ones with dementia.
Alison, I was worried that it was going to be a sad conversation, but I kind of feel that it's been a happy conversation. But I just wanted to honour you before all your family, all people who are watching around the world, and say thank you for writing the book, and thank you for caring for your mum, and thank you for just leaving such a happy memory of her. Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless you.